Welcome, everyone. The topic of this webinar is how to get a meeting with anyone. It's a skill that's relevant to a wide variety of people, perhaps and most obviously independent professionals, but also entrepreneurs, people looking to advance in their career, young professionals, or maybe people in career transition. Anyone, even quite established professionals who want to make a change and expand the range of what they're doing. I'll be taking questions as I go today, so feel free to use the chat box. For technical reasons, I'm not using video today, so the focus is on the slides. I'll try to answer any specific questions as you raise them. If I cannot for any reason, because I'm sure I won't be able to cover everything, I'm happy to get back to you individually after the webinar. Okay, let's make a start. As I've said, this skill is really important to a wide variety of people. It's a gateway to opportunity, quite obviously. It also, as we'll see later in the webinar, it uncovers the full value of your work. Without these conversations, it's actually quite hard to know the full value of your work. Of course, it promotes your services or promotes your skills, as the case may be. It helps you to refine your overall approach to market, and that's one of the big benefits that I've gained from practicing this skill. And as we will see as we go through today, it enhances your capacity to have impact because it actually builds your sense of self-worth as you go. Now, here we run into a fairly classic problem indeed in the run-up to the webinar. A number of people have emailed me saying that actually the real problem I have is identifying the right people to talk to. This is a fairly classic chicken and egg situation. And conventional wisdom here would tell you that first what you need to do is identify the people, and then you'll know how and with whom to have the conversations. As I say, that's conventional wisdom. It's true in theory. In theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there invariably is. And in practice, what I have discovered personally, and what many of the people I work with have discovered, is that actually the cart and the horse are the other way around. In practice, we start having these conversations, the conversations we're going to cover today, and as a result, we end up being introduced or meeting the right people. Now, I'm not going to focus today on how to identify the right people. Principal reason for that is that it's very individual. It depends on your type of services. It depends on the market that you are in or want to be in. And actually, it depends quite a bit on your individual style as well. So if you'd like some individual support with that, because it's not something we can actually cover in the webinar itself, by all means, book a call in. My diary is on that URL, and it will also be given to you at the end of the webinar today. So let's move on with how to have the conversation. Our agenda today, we're going to cover some of the classic pitfalls. There are 4 in particular, but it's not limited to 4. We're going to look at why these things happen, because if we just understand the pitfall without understanding what's below the waterline, we may not be able to correct it in ourselves. Then the 4 key parts of today are essential preparation, how to open up, how to make the initial contact, and that's the core of it, how to develop the discussion, and how to do wrap up and follow up. Obviously, as we go through and towards the end, I'll cover a few general tips that have helped people over the years. Okay, let's get started. To begin, I'd like to distinguish 3 types of business conversation. Because sometimes these get mixed up. So the first one up at the top is what I call a general needs discovery. That's basically a conversation you can be having with anyone. It is very often that top level conversation that allows you to get to the second level, which is where somebody might volunteer a specific need to you that they want your input on. And the problem that many people have is that they try to dive straight into specific needs discovery, partly through impatience or time pressures, but also for other reasons, that are a bit more nebulous, and we will come to them later. And then the third type, of course, is the type of conversations we all want to have, which is either the project initiation conversations or delivery, as the case may be. That's quite easy at that stage in the sense that it's driven by the specific needs that the client or the prospective employer has articulated to you. Our subject today is the top level. It's the open-ended explorations that you can have with a very wide audience, as you know, even those you randomly meet over dinner, as the case may be. There's no issue with rejection for the simple reason you're not putting forward anything to be rejected. Your self-worth is not on the line, because if they're interested, they're interested. If they're not, they're not. In practice, you'll be focusing on what's of interest to them more than you'll be expecting them to focus on what's of interest to you. As you go, you start to refine an approach to market, and as a result, you gain introductions to the right people with whom, of course, you can then go on, either then or subsequently, to have specific needs conversation. So this, if you like, is the art of general needs discovery. Okay. How do you feel when someone does this with you? Just take a moment again, if you can, and just go through in your mind, what is it, what's your reaction when somebody calls you or messages you or emails you out of the blue? Do you feel annoyed? Do you feel wary or defensive? Do you feel you couldn't care less? Do you feel a moment of apprehension going, what's this about? Or does it depend on who they are, how they approach you, etc.? You might want to take a few minutes. You don't have to respond to this, but just reflect for yourself what your intuitive feeling is, or what your intuitive reaction is when somebody contacts you. Let's talk about some of the classic pitfalls and relate them to whatever reaction you've perhaps written down in front of you. Here's a fairly common one. It may happen by email, it may happen by phone, it may happen by text. More and more it happens by social media, like a LinkedIn message, for example, where somebody will write to you out of the blue and say that they want to tell you about an exciting development. And notice, it's always an exciting development. That, I will argue, is a pitfall. It's a pitfall because it is triggering many of the reactions on the previous slide. After all, you're in the middle of a meeting. You are talking to a client, or you're talking to one of your key collaborators, and that conversation gets interrupted by somebody wanting to tell you about an exciting development. That can trigger resentful responses. More generally, but on the same, it's a slightly different tactic, but it's a variation on the same. I'd like to introduce our services. This is how a lot of meetings were set up some 10 to 20 years ago. It was perfectly normal for people to wish to introduce their services, and somehow we made time for that. Those days are rather long over. So I'd like to introduce our services. I'm going to argue is a pitfall. Tempting, still works in some circles with some people. I'm not saying none of these things, I'm not saying that any of these things never work, but on the whole, it's quite likely to trigger the I'm too busy allergy or any of the other responses on the preceding slide. But perhaps more perniciously for many people on a call like this is two other pitfalls, one of which is simply not doing that outreach at all. And that's a problem, because if we don't have the capacity to create meetings with people, if we're not able to make an approach, then the chances are that many aspects of our work and the value of our work are destined to remain hidden. And a second but related problem is getting ready to do these things. I've lost count of the number of people who have found themselves in what one man christened, one man labeled as preparation mania, getting ready to get ready to get ready in order to make these conversations. And whether that's strategizing what I'm going to say, or whether that's going through massive Excel spreadsheets about who I want to target, the nature of the preparation mania can vary. It is like all forms of sophisticated procrastination. It has a logic to it. I'm not saying we don't prepare. In fact, part of today's call is preparation. However, there is with some people a great risk around this preparation, that it goes on forever, so much so that they rarely get around to actually initiating a conversation. And I'm going to argue that the underlying problem behind a lot of this isn't just the behavior, but it's what's going on in our heads. And one of the things I'm inviting you to do on this webinar is to challenge a little bit what might be going on in your head. Are you, for example, preoccupied with demonstrating credentials, with proving yourself and your credibility? Are you in some way seeking to prove yourself in one form or another? Are you, or might you be seen to be fishing for problems that you can fix? I mean, isn't that what we feel when others do this? I've noted one of the comments here already about getting getting messages for services that we would never use, and that if somebody just took the time to find out the most basic thing about us, they wouldn't be pitching those services to us in the first place. In other words, what a great waste of their time as much as ours. Very often what happens is that professionals go out just fishing for the problems they can fix and having no interest in any other problems. Result is that loss of trust, that diminished credibility, and that sense of resentment that some of you might have been jotting down a few moments ago. So, this is why and how self-worth is a game changer. What we do is from day one, even in our preparation, we put the focus on other people rather than ourselves. Our task, as described in the book, The Self-Worth Safari, is to be interested rather than trying to be interesting. And we're going to begin the process of reaching out to people from a perspective of being interested rather than trying to be interesting. As a result, that removes an awful lot of stress from the interaction. There's a lot less angst about it. And perhaps more importantly, it builds trust. Because when we feel okay in ourselves, then we are free to go and have this type of exploration. We're free to be interested rather than preoccupied with trying to be interesting. Okay, let's get into the preparation for this. There's essentially 3 things you want to think about by way of preparation. Number 1, what's your reason for the call? So when you contact somebody, they're in the very first sentence, we want to be able to say the reason I'm calling is. But we want that reason, ideally, to resonate with them rather than be something on our agenda. More on that in a second. Secondly, how well do you know them? The tone of voice you'll use with somebody that you used to work with 5 years ago will be different to the tone of voice you'll use with a complete stranger. And putting those two together, you'll want to think about the medium of the approach. And essentially, apart from face-to-face, which of course is an option, but most of the time you'll have the option of email, question mark, call, question mark, or text, question mark, or there should be a question mark. And I recommend text, by the way, as long as you have their number, and as long as it's reasonable, you'd have their number. I find that either a Skype text or a WhatsApp text is actually, it's respectful of their time, so it's less intrusive than a call, but less likely to get lost in a maze of other emails, for example. Many people prefer email, but honestly, that's usually a manifestation of their own fear rather than because it's the best medium. Email, the risk with email is that it just gets lost. By the time that you get around to responding to that email, it's like 2 weeks later, and in some cases, people just want to get rid of it at that stage. But by far the most important thing that you'll want to do during your preparation is the reason for the call. And the full significance of that is going to be more visible if I go on to the next slide, and then we can perhaps flip back, which is how we're going to open the discussion. Because once you understand that, it will be kind of easy to see what it is you need to prepare. So when you start the conversation, you want to be able to say, you know, this is John from Selfworth Academy. Now, obviously, let me be clear here. You want to fill in your own name and company where it says X and Y, just in case anyone is literally on the call. I don't expect you to say, this is John from Selfworth Academy. So you state who you are, where you're calling from. If they already know you, there'll be no need. Most important is that the next sentence out of your mouth needs to be something in their world rather than in yours. This is why you need to prepare. So this might be, I've been intrigued by what you've written on LinkedIn, or I noticed that your company is in the papers, or whatever, what I drove by your building, whatever it is, but the very first sentence or clause, it's not even a full sentence, out of your mouth, if you're going to practice a self-worth approach rather than a self-esteem approach, if you're going to permanently escape from self-preoccupation, here's the key. The next sentence out of your mouth needs to be about them, not about you. Yes, this means you'll have to do some research, and yes, this means you won't be able to copy it from one person to another. Tough, but you're going to get better results. And then you can say, the reason I'm calling is, and the reason you're calling might be you're running an event. Okay, fine. The reason you're calling might be you've just published something. The reason you're calling might be you're going to be in Amsterdam next week, whatever it is. And I'd like to get some feedback from you, or I'd like to share with you. Again, this is where it gets a bit individual and where the language gets a bit, has to be customized, I should say, as well. How about we have a coffee or a Skype or a whatever in order to discuss ... Now, let me go through the 5 clauses again, one by one, because this is the core of today. You introduce yourself, clause 1. You say why you're reaching out to them in 2 parts. You first of all say something about them, and then you say something about you in that order. What most people try to do is the reverse. You know, hi, this is John from Selfworth Academy. We're running an event in London next week. Yeah, okay, you're selling. Bang. I've been intrigued by your post on LinkedIn about employee engagement. The reason I'm calling is, by the way, the best reason to be calling is to ask questions rather than start pitching. Later on, when we come to specific needs discovery conversations, you can be more upfront here. But what we're doing in general needs discovery is we're finding out what's important to them. And that's particularly important right now. Question from Russell. How much of this would you use in a text or a message? Very little. Very little. As little as you could get away with, Russell. And this is where it depends a little on how well you know them. Excuse me. Voice problem. This is where it depends a little bit on how well you know them. If you've already got an established rapport with somebody, then it might be, hey, I'm in I'm in Paris next week. Could we get together? If you don't know them, you might have to set out the reason for the contact, in which case this will work. So your preparation or your email to them, if you're emailing, might well include the elements that are here. Pretty much in this order. It's the order that's important. Notice the bit that's usually missing is this bit. There are people who do this is John from Selfworth Academy, etc. The reason I'm calling is I'd like to get your feedback, etc. There are people who do that, but I am suggesting in this webinar that what we need to do is lead with something that has intrigued us about them. Okay, point made, I think. Let's look at how we develop the conversation. 1 or 2 of you may recognize where this is going, just slightly different pictures. we all have our stuff. We have our expertise, we have our experience, we have our qualifications, etc. This is our comfort zone. We tend to like talking about it. They too have their stuff. In fact, that's what we're trying to get to. And a lot of people who have particularly been trained in sales, and specifically if they've done spin selling, will be heading straight into the what are your pain points, what are your problems, etc. Because the belief, of course, is that as soon as we uncover those, then we can sell to them. But you know, it's now 20 years later, and these people are very sophisticated, and they know that that's why people call them up. So, suggestion is what you're looking for is the shared context. In other words, all the things that will impact their stuff, or your stuff in this case, if not now, at the very least, very soon. If it's in the distant future, that might be less powerful. So naturally, you're thinking, yeah, well, what kind of things will that be? Well, again, depends on whether you're doing business to business selling or selling, let's say, a more personal touch. But let's take some business examples. That might be some technical constraints of software. That might be some legislation changes. That could be shifting demand. I've seen and worked with a sales team who have done a lot of these conversations around the changing purchasing habits of millennials, for example. It could be an anticipated glut in supply or a shortage, either way. For example, I've worked with a company for whom one of their best talking points for the last 10 years has been a projected shortage of manual labor. Very easy contextual conversation to have. You can begin to see how that leads into how will that impact you. You can talk about what their competitors are doing, or you can research what their competitors are doing. More personally, for example, maybe you're in HR, maybe you're in executive coaching, maybe you're in training. Here the topics will be different, of course. You might be talking about the specific challenges of companies where managers are in roles for shorter periods than ever before. You might be talking about increasing levels of burnout and stress and anxiety in the workplace. You might well be talking, as I sometimes are, about the need to reinvent yourself. I do quite a lot of work with people who need to reinvent themselves. Might be that people need to learn new skills. Why? Because the future is going to be different to the past, and therefore they need to learn new skills. That can bring up issues of confidence as much as issues of competence. It might be the desire that's increasingly talked about for reasons that are not part of today's call, but might well be part of a future one, the desire for community and belonging, and the difficulties that many people have, both in work and in society at large, in finding really authentic sense of community and belonging. It could be the rise in anxiety and uncertainty that is pretty much everywhere. There's a long list of things that provide you with material for this orange layer here, which is all the things that are going to impact them now or very soon, that are of shared interest to you as it is to them. And this is what I call the art of context conversation. This is the art of having general business discovery conversations before we start plowing into selling, which all too often just activates the allergies of the other people. And actually, because we know it's going to do that, we end up procrastinating. We end up postponing those conversations because we know we're going to get bounced, or we know we're going to get the I'm too busy. And therefore, we resist having the conversations that we should, inverted commas, be having. So in developing that dialogue, you'll be asking questions. You'll be asking things like, how are you affected by ... You might be asking things like, who is most affected by ... Very often the who question is more important than the how question. You will often be asking, why is that important? Or why is that important right now, as the case may be. You'll be, for example, you'll be exploring things like, how do you see priorities changing next year in the light of impending legislation change, in the light of more and more people resigning. What impact will that have? What else? What else? What else? Um, where do you reach out for outside support? That's a perfectly reasonable question to ask as part of general needs discovery. You're not pitching, you're not selling. Obviously, we're getting close. But it is a question to them about where and how do they reach out. It might, in some cases, get them thinking about how they should reach out. It might even prompt them to reach out. But it's activating that part of their brain, if you like. Where are you going to get some external input, or when do you get external input? Very relevant both in business and in personal contexts. Yep, the idea of reaching out is just terrifying in itself, and very often it is. Thanks for that comment, Xavier. It is, you know, that's a fact. The idea of reaching out can in itself be scary, and what I'm attempting to cover today's webinar is some of the underlying thinking behind that. Because if we're reaching out to explore, there's nothing scary about that. We're all entitled to be curious. We have an I can't say the word, inalienable right to be curious. You don't have to justify it. You don't have to earn it. So we are all entitled to reach out in a spirit of curiosity. So a few practical points. Again, it's very easy to slip into selling, to slip into that self-serving communication that Ian's just alluded to. Very, very easy. And we may have to consciously remind ourselves to keep the focus on their issues and not start dropping into my expertise is sentences in the middle of general needs discovery. That's pretty much a mistake. When they do volunteer an issue or they do volunteer a risk, rather than rushing in trying to solve it, which, you know, many of us have made that mistake, rather than doing so, we explore the impact of that. So when a problem is on the table, explore the impact of the problem before you start solving the problem. That's particularly true in technical sales. When problems get put on the table in highly technical environments, then you know, engineers and salespeople and all manner of problem fixers tend to jump in and start solving the problem. And unfortunately, what that does is precisely as Angela has implied in her comment there about intention. What it does is it betrays that our intention doesn't really lie in discovery. Our intention then often lies in being clever, or in demonstrating something, or in selling, as the case may be. And even if it's not selling, even if we're volunteering a solution out of cleverness, that's often not appreciated. Genuine interest is appreciated. And if you want to see the truth of that, just see what life is like when you're on that side of the table. So for all of these reasons, please don't start selling yet. There'll be a time for that, but it's later. And remember, please, you've got nothing to prove. You already have self-worth. You don't have to demonstrate anything to anyone. And therefore, you know, you're okay already. So you can go out and have these explorations without fear, without stress, because you're okay before you go. You're not going out hungry. You are already well fed. So moving towards the end of the meeting, typically these meetings will be about 30 minutes, sometimes shorter. So if it's by Skype, it may well be 10, 15 minutes. Suggestion, ask them for something. For example, ask for an introduction. For example, who else might be interested in having this exploration? It's a very simple way to get more referrals and more introduction. By the same token, I would suggest you offer to send them something. Not only does that provide a practical way to get their email address if you don't already have it, or to at least check that you've got a current email address for them. But in offering to send them something and subsequently meeting that commitment, you're demonstrating your trustworthiness. This may not be conscious on their part, but they will subconsciously recognize your trustworthiness if you're reliable by sending them something you have offered. And perhaps, where appropriate, refine your approach together. As many of you know, I'm a big fan of research-led marketing, where we go out with questions rather than going out with answers. And one of the great benefits that creates is it allows you to refine the approach as you go. So you don't have to get it right first time. In many cases, it's the second or third research project, if you like, that's successful. The first two were simply there to help us to get to that one. So the great benefit of these conversations is that you can refine your approach together. So maybe you're going out exploring employee engagement. And actually, as you have the conversations, maybe you learn from the people you're talking to that perhaps performance or dealing with uncertainty is more important. Maybe your pet topic going out was employee engagement, but by the time you've done a few conversations, you're beginning to pick up on the fact that actually there's a hotter topic in town, like dealing with ambiguity and uncertainty. So therefore, you get to refine the approach together, and as you go out with your next inquiry or your next meeting, it's more powerful as a result. And please remember, it's very rare in sales, in any kind of B2B environment in particular. The rules slightly different in consumer marketing, but it's very rare in B2B that one meeting closes a sale. I worked with a client a few years ago who measured this quite carefully, and they found that those who were able to get a second meeting were 5 times more likely to close sales than those who didn't get a second meeting. So the art is in getting the second meeting. So if you know that's true, plan it. And most importantly, plan who should be there. So it's not just about when it should be, but who should be present. Because the chances are it's some other director or some other manager. And it could be a level up or a level down. I had one of these conversations yesterday. In actual fact, the next meeting is with somebody a level down, not a level up. But that tells me that this is going somewhere. So who should be there? If they're answering that question, that's a pretty good sign. And keep exploring, please, who else might be interested in this topic. So the more you explore, the more you have these conversations, it builds momentum. And therefore, they will tell you who else you should be talking to. Charlotte is asking how long should the first meeting be? That will vary. I mean, if they'll give you an hour, enjoy. But in the rather busy world that many of us inhabit these days, you're probably quite happy if you get 30 minutes. An hour is comfortable. It's also cultural. So meetings in London, for example, tend to be quite a bit shorter than they are in Lisbon. Again, there's cultural reasons around that. The key now in following up is maintaining momentum. So that's sending what you've promised. That demonstrates your reliability. It's also giving them feedback. You know, I was particularly struck by your emphasis on performance. I was particularly struck by the issue you raised about people from different generations working together. Well, you know, that shows you were listening. So I was particularly struck by the way, of course, these sentences often become your raw material for your next conversation. You know, I had a meeting yesterday, and the topic that we kept coming back to was dealing with uncertainty where the future is unclear and the effect that that has on performance. Does this topic resonate with you? And most importantly, now that you've had a meeting, you're in the best possible frame of mind to have the next one, or at least to set up the next one. So when you do, when you come off a meeting like this, even while still in transit, coming from it, very often we're in that extroverted frame of mind, where it's quite easy for us to contact somebody else. Now, who are they? As I said at the outset, the finding the right people to talk to is a bit more individual, so there's probably not something that I can easily cover on a webinar for everybody. So feel free to book in a call to discuss that. The sorts of questions that might help you with that can be a bit of reflection on who have been your best clients to date. So if you are planning a call, by the way, it'd be no harm to send me an email. Leave you an email address at the end, where just add a few paragraphs if you can on who have been your best clients to date and why. What niche would you like to get into? If you know, and even if you don't, well, what characteristics of a niche would you like to get into? For example, a great conversation with somebody recently who is actually a very successful professional, but is bored by what they're doing. And one of the reasons they're bored by what they're doing is they want to be working with more creative people. And while it's not 100% clear yet who the more creative people are, at least they're a little bit closer to knowing what the niche might look like. Even if those two questions don't immediately pop names into your head, have a think about who do you know who studies the future? Who do you know who's trend watching? Who do you know who is just generally interested in where are we going, or the future of networks, or the future of technology, or any kind of trend watchers? Why? Because they often, apart from their networks, they often are picking up themes earlier than others are. So make friends with people who are interested in the future. And if your focus is perhaps more in the present or the past, where do you see people repeatedly struggling? Where do you see training programs failing? Where do you see projects not running to schedule and causing overruns? What are the dimensions that people miss out when they're planning a website development? What happens 9 out of 10 social media projects? Etc. Why do community managers invariably find another job within a year? Whatever wherever. I'm not sure that's true. I'm just ad-libbing where you might spot repeated struggle. Wherever you're spotting repeated struggle, usually that's a clue, A, as to where your talent lies, and B, to who else you might well be talking to. Okay, I've tried to cover questions as I go through. If you are looking for individual support, please get in touch. The link is at the bottom of that screen. If you haven't yet, if there's anybody out there who hasn't yet ordered a copy of the Selfworth Safari, it's on Amazon. Please help yourself. Very relevant to all of this. Our webinars are on the webinar page. There is a coaching course planned, and dates, etc., are on the courses page. Again, I'm not going to take up the call talking about those, but if your interest is in developing self-worth with others, or in applying the practical self-worth skills, either in leadership or in entrepreneurship, or for that matter, in personal life, then if developing self-worth in others is part of your toolkit, then I really would urge you to check out the next Selfworth coaching course, which is on that link there. Thanks everybody for participating, and I wish you all a really good day and good luck with those meetings.